To Engaging with Stakeholders. What can we learn from action researchers? A webinar sponsored by Sage's MethodSpace. I'm Michael Todd, the editor of MethodSpace's sister site, Social Science Space. As we settle in for what promises to be a lively conversation about action research, take a moment to bookmark MethodSpace, your home for articles, videos, podcasts, and events centered on research methodology, evaluation, academic writing, and ethics, and many more things in the social and behavioral science disciplines. One of those events, this webinar, will be recorded, and the link will be sent out to webinar registrants. But the recording will also reside at MethodSpace, and that's why we want you to bookmark it. And you can always view it along with many other archive webinars for free at any time. Speaking of this webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A channel, which should be at the bottom of your screens. We'll be scanning that channel for questions to the panelists. Simultaneously, we will also have that chat channel open so you can communicate with all the registrants in today's event. Give that chat channel a quick try and tell us where you're logging in from today. And lastly, let us know how we did today by telling us through the comments on the recording of this webinar on MethodSpace. If you're interested in research methods, do also sign up for the Methods Minute newsletter. You can see the URL for signups, methodspace.com/methods-minute-newsletter below. It's a great way to keep your finger on the pulse of research methods, trends, products, and events delivered directly to you every month. Now let me introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Janet Sammons. Janet is a Research Methods Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace and the author of many research methodology textbooks, including the most recent one pictured here, the second edition of Doing Qualitative Research. Take it away, Janet.
Okay, I'm not seeing the slides. Michael, do we have the slides? Aha. Okay, so we have a very simple agenda here today because we want to focus on our interaction with all of you. So after this brief introduction, we will move into the panel discussion, and this time we will break throughout to take some questions, and we'll leave some time at the end for additional discussion. Next slide. If you're new to methodspace.com, this is a blog community that is sponsored by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in everything to do with designing, planning, carrying out, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or a very experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. So that's why I find this work so exciting. We have a chance to explore a lot of different things and ask very difficult and challenging questions. If you go to the next slide. So each year we have an editorial calendar with a different kind of focus throughout each month. But we've also got some overarching themes that we are trying to explore. So in 2022, kind of beginning to sort of come out of the pandemic and all of the chaos that caused, we were asking, what is it that makes research relevant to people's lives, to the development of the scholarship in the field, to practice, to policy, and not just what is the impact when it is done, but, how can we make sure that we're studying important problems that, where we can try to illuminate some of those issues and provide some new knowledge. Then coming into this year, 2023, building on that exploration, we're asking, who decides? How do we decide what problems to study? What merits the kind of discipline and time that it takes to do empirical research? What settings? What population? Who makes those decisions? what sources are valid or not. And then coming out of that, what's our responsibility as a researcher? What roles do we need to take to make sure that we're being transparent about all of those kinds of issues when we talk about our research and try to explain it, not only to other academics and to people who understand the scholarly types of writing, but to the people who may be able to put this work into practice. So when I came up with the idea of trying to have a discussion about these issues in a webinar format, there was no doubt in my mind who I needed to invite, because we had a chance to work together a couple of years ago when Alfredo, Roz, and Ernie all contributed to Method Space as mentors in residence. And when you receive the follow-up link to this recording, we'll also send you links to that entire collection of resources, which are quite rich. So just to briefly introduce Alfredo Ortiz Aragón, who is at the University of Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas, in the US. Roz Beadle, who is visiting in Texas, but works in Australia at Flinders University College of Medicine and Public Health, and Ernie Stringer, who is at the Curtin University in Australia. And as you can see, Alfredo and Ernie are co-authors of the 5th edition of the excellent text Action Research. And I hear rumors that a new edition may be in the work. So why don't you begin by just giving us a little bit more of an introduction to yourselves and tell us a little bit more about who you are.
So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I came from a teaching background, 10 years as a primary school teacher, and experience in that context led me to try and understand the issues in teaching. So over time, I've spent probably 10 years visiting universities, both as a student and a scholar, to learn more about research, to understand the issues in my teaching. A little side thing is just recently, I decided to relearn the piano, which I taught myself as a teenager and then forgot 30 years ago. So I'm in San Antonio practicing on Alfredo's piano.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz Aragón, originally from northern New Mexico, a town called Pojoaque. And I came into action research as a frustrated practitioner. So I've been working for many years in international development settings, doing something we call capacity building. And at some point I felt like what we were doing was really creative and yet meaningless at the same time. I was giving people a good buzz, good feeling, but then kind of evaporating and disappearing once the little workshops and things would end. So I came into action research looking for meaningful methodology that I didn't feel I was getting in my practitioner world of community engagement. Mm-hmm. And I'm here in San Antonio, Texas. I'm not a Texan, I'm a New Mexican, but that's a whole other webinar that will be delivered shortly.
Thank you for the introduction, Janet. My name is Roz, and before I let you know about how I came into action research, I just wanted to, I was thinking about what is the most important thing that I'd like to share with you today. And I think for me right now, everything is feeling a little surreal here in San Antonio. 2 days ago, I arrived from a very small Aboriginal community in the Northern Territory of Australia. It's an island 600 kilometres east of Darwin called Gallowingpoo. And when I say a small community, it's relatively big for an Aboriginal community. It's 3,000 people. And the hat that I'm really wearing there is, although I consider myself a researcher, the primary hat that I like to wear in these contexts is as a community support worker. And another very important thing is that I have left behind my beautiful family. So I also wear a hat as a parent for my 2 lovely children, Delilah and Joshua, who I'm away from for the next couple of weeks. And something also important is that I would like to acknowledge the many Indigenous women around Australia, in the Torres Strait, in Tennant Creek, in Warburton, and in Gallowinkel, who are really the foundations for everything that I've learned that I'm going to share with you today. They've been mentors and supporters and have helped me understand that there are many different ways of doing, being, and knowing in this world, and that understanding that there are different worldviews have really helped position me as a researcher and my approach to action research. And I should acknowledge too that a lot of my action research learnings have been thanks to Ernie Stringer, who I spent many years working alongside in Warburton in the Nunandarra lands in Western Australia. Thanks, Janet.
So it's clear that one of the most important parts of action research, and what I hope our viewers and readers will think about, is that, you know, there are ways of using these ideas, whether you are specifically using an action research methodology or not. But at the heart of that whole process is building relationships and trust. And you've talked about some of the communities that you've worked with in your career. Maybe you could begin by telling us what you've learned about building relationships with people who may be either within your own culture or in a different culture, different coming from a different mindset. You know, where do you start?
So I'll start off with that one, Janet, because it's very relevant to my experience as a school teacher. Earlier, perhaps after 3 years of being a primary school teacher in suburban Australia, I was assigned to a small desert community teaching the children of Aboriginal people who lived a traditional hunting, gathering life, slept on the ground, and the kids came out of the bush and into the school. I knew nothing about them. I had no training in dealing with cultural difference. And so I set about on the first morning of school, presenting the lessons that I had learned and did so well in the city, only to find that the children did not engage with me. I could barely get a word out of them. I would set them a writing thing and they'd sort of go through the writing thing. But if I tried to talk with them or get them to talk to me, nothing. And by the end of the morning, I was really, as a teacher, at wit's end. What's wrong with these kids? Are they dumb? Can't they do anything? Why can't they speak? So after lunch, in desperation, I decided to take them for a walk out through the bush. Take them for a walk out into the bush. So they came out into the bush with me and they came to life. And they clustered around me. They brought me lizards and insects. They showed me roots that they ate, berries off the trees. They gave me a lesson in nature study. And they were so alive. They were laughing and talking and telling me what was in the bushland that we were walking through. It was a wonderful experience. And I thought, wow, these kids know a lot and they're so lively. They know so much. And that was an epiphany that changed my life. I know from that experience, everywhere I go, I know that people that I work with have a wealth of experience and understanding of knowledge that enriches any of the work that we do. So I am a participatory researcher. I know that the opening of my any research is to go to people who are at the center of the issues that I'm exploring and develop a relationship by greeting them and in a number of ways developing a relationship which enables them to trust me to tell their stories and reveal the knowledge and the skills that they have within them. So some of what we talked about today will relate to Aboriginal people in Australia, but I've taken this all over the world. I have, particularly in the US, been in visiting professor in Illinois, University of Illinois, University of New Mexico, Texas A&M University, and more recently in Cornell University. And the contexts in which I've been able to do research have not been Aboriginal, the mainstream American, but the same processes that I learned in that little Aboriginal village opened my eyes to the wealth of resources and the richness of knowledge that is in all people. Ros.
I'm just wondering where to start here. I feel like, Janet, I've got a lot I'd like to share in terms of how we position ourselves as researchers in a way to enable research to be participatory. And I think the first overarching thing I'd like to note is that it's essential to be critical and reflexive of yourself as a researcher, as you're positioning yourself for me, in a cross-cultural context. So I'm also going to be talking about a remote Aboriginal context. And I would like to flash back to, goodness, 14 years ago when I first arrived in Warburton in the Ngunundjatjara lands. And that's where I first met Ernie. And what came with me was a preconception that I very much wanted to do PhD research. In fact, I'd enrolled in a PhD, but I also brought with me some preconceived ideas on what the problems or issues were for remote Aboriginal people. And with Ernie's gentle mentoring, but also as my relationships grew with the participants, that particular idea for my study, or the research question, which I'd supplied to the university in my application process, really got blown out of the water. I won't go into too much detail, but basically this was not an issue for the people. And I learnt very quickly that it was essential that I take off my research hat while I establish relationships, that rightly so, Indigenous people were largely wary and distrustful of non-Indigenous people coming to their space, wanting to do research. And instead, over time, I learned that establishing relationships, it was important to let the people guide what my role was, or what they would like it to be, and what they needed in order for me to be able to support them to help fulfill their wishes in what they were doing. In this case, it was a group of women who were establishing a breakfast program in the community, local Ngunundjatjara women who wanted to provide school breakfast for their children in the community in an effort to enhance school attendance. And over time, my role emerged, and vaguely speaking, we called it a community support worker role. And this is something we may touch on later in the webinar, but we took a developmental approach to doing that. And one of the things that I learned early on to do, which is quite challenging in this context, but was to bracket my own experiences, was to put aside all of those preconceived notions that I brought with me about remote Aboriginal communities, and to put them completely to one side and open my ears and my heart to what the people, what was concerning for the people and what issues they wanted to address. And
Can I break in here?
you can, yes.
Okay, so I can remember clearly Ros coming into the community and coming to me very early on and saying, "Oh, Ernie, I'd love to do research here. I'm really interested in why young Aboriginal women have babies so early, and that must ruin their lives." And I said, "Well, just come and I'll introduce you to some of the women that I'm working with." And she was gloriously open to talking with the women, being with the women. And over time, what happened, Ros?
Well, over the time, I found ways of establishing relationships with the women. And one of those things I distinctly remember was I was very new to the context. I'd never lived so remotely. And when we're talking about remote here, this is a community 1,600 kilometres. So that's about 1,000 miles from the closest capital city. So we're a long way in the middle of the Western Desert. And I distinctly remember I was really struggling to have conversations. I was doing a lot of sitting and listening and observing and being guided by Ernie. And one morning I told the women, "Oh, I'm traveling to Kalgoorlie next week for a meeting." And all of a sudden, this rich dialogue unfolded whereby the women started telling me all of the different things I would see along the journey, because, you know, Aboriginal people have such an affinity with the land, and they know it so well. And this was all new for me. And that was the start of something. I guess that was an epiphanic moment for me when I realized, yes, even though we come from such different worlds, there are ways that we can connect, and we continue to build this fantastic library of ways that we could connect as I stayed in the community. And look, I think that's another aspect of relationships I wanted to touch on, is that I was in a wonderful position at the start of my PhD to be able to build relationships just based on the fact that I had very few other commitments that were going to take me away from the community. And I ended up staying in Warburton for 5 years. And the actual research part of my PhD didn't commence well into the maybe second, even third year of the time that I was there, because there really needed to be time for me to understand the social and cultural context of the people with whom I was working with, and for them to be able to feel comfortable with me to help offer ideas of different ways, effective, culturally safe ways of doing research together, collaboratively. So
what happened, Ros, to your research about why young Aboriginal women had babies so early?
It's never happened. The question became, what happened over the 5 years I was working with the women is that, working developmentally, the Ngunundjatjara women, who were known as the breakfast minma in the community, were able to mould a worker role in a way that responded to their social and cultural context. Now, that was my role as community support worker. And very quickly, I identified, and the women too identified, that they had a very unique story to tell about how they positioned themselves as workers in a social and cultural context, and how that largely contrasted with how non-Indigenous people expected people to do work and be workers. And that ended up becoming, after many, many years, that ended up becoming the basis of my dissertation. And really, the question that my dissertation was answering didn't properly unfold until a good 5 years into being alongside the women, working alongside the women, and what they taught me.
Yeah, so consider doing a dissertation that takes 5 years. It needn't take that long. She was a little bit slow in getting into the research because she was enjoying the work so much.
I was enjoying establishing the relationships, which was essential for getting into the research. And we maybe need to note here, Ernie, the PhD actually took me 10 years. That was before the writing started.
Well, there were two babies involved in that 10-year period, I might say, and a few health issues as well. So.
There were a few babies, and that just helped me buy some extra time, which is what I needed, and that the university was very hesitant to give me. But that can maybe be part of the next topic, Janet.
So if I could make the transition, my coming to America really was to learn how to do research. And through my experiences in learning within these Aboriginal contexts, I wanted to enrich my understanding of research. So I started coming regularly to the US to learn about research, not just the methods, but the rationale for doing research in particular ways. And so I was able to join with some really fine scholars here to explore the dimensions of research and the possibilities for doing research that really made a difference in people's lives. And just a few years ago, I came upon a very fine gentleman who seemed to me to encapsulate in his being this notion of doing participatory action research with people to make a difference in their lives. Alfredo.
Thank you. Yeah, it's in my origin story in action research comes from the practitioner side of things, working years as a practitioner. And like I said earlier, being frustrated with the way we were working. And a simple way of reducing it is we were working in a non-relational way. We were kind of coming in to try to wow people with methods. You know, researchers come in to try to solve things with interventions, none of which is really about saying, I'm here to actually figure out how I can add value to ongoing processes. And that's going to require me to work more slowly, to try to connect in a more relational kind of way, and to figure out what it is that we should even work on, because I couldn't possibly know what the right topics were for a community or for a set of people outside of conversation with them. Yet we do that all the time. So my take on relationship building is it's the purpose. In some ways, you could think of the relationship side as more important than immediate outcomes, because, for example, we can work together with community actors to improve the way LGBTQ plus people are treated in the healthcare system, for example, when some are often treated very poorly. And we can achieve outcomes of improved treatment and improved health outcomes. But it's just as important, and sometimes in some ways more important, that we achieve strong relationships with members of that community that allow us to continue working together, or allow trust to emerge so they can say, hey, Ortiz and others, come in and help us, because we trust the way we work together, and we'd like to add in some more elements that make our arguments more powerful and allow us to do work together in a way that helps us change our own lives. And so to me, the outcome of strong relationships is just as or more important as the any sort of impact that you might have in any specific area. So that's how I look at relationship building. It's the purpose. We're successful if we get to a point of strong relationships, because that's what allows us to work in a certain way together, and that's what allows us to act into the future together. And I've got more to share about examples and such, but I think that's good for now. And on the relationship side for me, I can add in more in the next questions.
I'd just like to add one more thing, Janet, if that's okay. And I think one of the reasons for establishing relationships, but also having prolonged engagement and commitment to a context where you're working, is that it can really help you as an outsider to see the strengths within the community. And that then when you're working alongside participants, you're really coming from a strengths-based approach, and that you're able to build on those strengths as you support those participants to identify solutions to problems in the community. And as I'm sure many listeners here are aware today, but although from superficially and at a surface level, there can be, I guess, some deficit approaches to understanding and seeing many of these contexts, that, you know, we know that there are huge cultural strengths in these areas, and I don't need to go into them in detail, but that is your starting point for building relationships and doing participatory action research in a context. Did either of you want to comment on that?
I want to add one thing to that. So I agree with that. I also think something that helped me transition from pure practitioner into action researcher was we had designed, this was a long time ago for my PhD, but we had designed a new way of doing organizational capacity building that was more participatory. And I'd come up with this brilliant design. On how I was going to work differently with people. And my co-researcher at the time, Juan Carlos Giles, I showed him this diagram of how we were going to work in a new participatory way with this particular set of organizations. And he asked me, he said, Ortiz, he was in Spanish, but he said, where are you in the picture? I was like, okay, Juan Carlos, I see what you're saying. I've been learning about this stuff. I know, okay, I've got to be more reflective. He's like, no. Where are you in the picture? It's like, okay, I get it, Juan Carlos, fine. I'm going to be more aware. We're going to reflect more. No, draw yourself into this picture. Literally, I want to see where you are. You're trying to fix other people. You're trying to solve their problems. Your own transformation is just as much at stake in this. Your ability to come in, not only to address things based on what people want and need, but to be open to the fact that you may learn, hopefully you're adding more value than you're taking, but that you are not coming in as an expert that somehow can help others out, becoming part of the same process of improvement. And there's a lot of ways of kind of nuancing that argument, but I think it's also important to consider that we're huge beneficiaries in terms of learning and in terms of relationship richness, cultural learning in these processes, and we need to recognize that and not think that we're coming in to help other people as if we have so much to offer all the time.
I think that is something that constantly shocks me in these contexts, is that often it's the agency and service workers who turn to each other as the experts to find out what's happening in this context. And I think when you position yourselves the way that we do as participatory action researchers, you come to realize very quickly that of course it's the people who are the experts who can identify the issues and identify the solutions in community. And yeah, that's been eye-opening for me. And it still happens a lot that agency and service workers continue to see themselves as experts coming in from the outside and bringing in their skills and their solutions to issues. And it's just something that we need to be very aware of as practitioners.
Well, I think that's a good segue to another topic I wanted to hear from you about, which is kind of, you know, how you bridge these, you know, different demands. So, you know, if we're academic researchers as doctoral students or as faculty members or people working in different kinds of research institutes, we have, you know, we're coming in with some knowledge that we've gained from the literature and from the, you know, field of study. And, you know, so we've got that. We've also got requirements that we need to fulfill to, you know, get the work done and get it published and, you know, succeed in our field. So, you know, when I ask you, you know, how do you do problem solving when those agendas are different? You know, there's a little bit of, you know, maybe even conflict resolution, but then at the same time, it's almost, you know, how do you bridge these different kinds of knowledge as a scholar? And I mean, I like Alfredo, you're, you know, talking about, well, like, where are you? You know, I think the positionality piece is something that we really have to think about in that situation. But, you know, how do you say, you know, bring the knowledge that you gain from scholarly work into your practice and vice versa? You know, how do you make that bridge and deal with disagreements?
I might open up with my experience of that. Again, it's an Aboriginal experience, or an experience with Aboriginal people, I might say. I was asked, having gone into teacher education by this stage in a university in Perth, Western Australia, I was asked by some Aboriginal people to help them establish a Centre for Aboriginal Studies. And as part of that centre, we provided research services to Aboriginal communities, to Aboriginal agencies and government agencies that were having issues providing services to Aboriginal people. Now, we developed a particular participatory approach to research. We knew that we couldn't just, as researchers and experts, go in and do research on Aboriginal people because it was so culturally inappropriate. So we developed ways of doing what we called community-based research, which was very participatory, and asked them, what are the problems you're experiencing? Or in relation to a problem, they would come to us with a problem. What can we do about this problem? We would go and work with them to assist them to work through a process where they understood the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, and work towards a solution to the problem or the issue. Not necessarily a problem, but often. So we developed this particular participatory approach, which had the end of which was not just a research report to be published, but the end of that project was a solution to the problems of the people. Now, this became so successful so quickly that this research service covered the state very rapidly. We then tried to make a research program within the university. And of course, it didn't fit the style, the nature, and the protocols of university. And we had to find ways of explaining and framing and describing the research which fit research protocols and university ethics protocols and so on. So that was the nature of what we were facing. It felt like the university was pushing back on us, but we discovered ways through it. So what was
Yeah, well, I like to think
that for one, the research topics, they don't, I like to say they don't exist as a gap in the literature. They exist as a gap in real life. And while we can know that there are social determinants that say X number of people are, tending to suffer from diabetes at this age, if you already have the solution in advance of engaging with people, you've just gone down the wrong pathway. So I think we were talking about this yesterday. One way of kind of reconciling some of these things is whether the funder can see it clearly or not. I'm not advocating being non-transparent, but building into every single project, even when you have a pressure of having overly defined a topic in advance, build in time to validate, to ground truth, and to reframe it actually, if possible, with the community that you're working with, so that they say, this is our problem, this is what we want to do, this is how we want to affect it. And also leave room to add things on that you weren't planning on doing. So that requires not overly detailed planning everything you're going to do, but leaving space to build that in. Now, if you're able to, I would go further. And I would say, we have an example recently where we were trying to work with breastfeeding mothers to figure out in some a little bit lower economic areas of the city, to figure out what are their good practices, what are their struggles, what is their community knowledge around breastfeeding that might be useful to other people. This is part of a health equity grant. And we started off the process saying, kind of open, saying, hey, let's use photo voice, taking pictures and using that as a way to generate dialogue, to talk about what we know and what we want to share about breastfeeding. And we spent a lot of time developing relationships and just getting to know each other. This was during COVID too, so a lot of it was online. And we created this photo voice exhibit that had all these pictures and narratives. And we got to a point where, okay, this is okay. What do we all think about this? And the general response was, including from the community experts, was, that's okay, but it doesn't really represent our voice or our wisdom the way we want it to. So we said, well, that didn't work. Great. What do we do then? And we created a participatory process using Padlet and a few other tools to identify a better way of representing their knowledge. And we came to an agreement on creating a zine, a magazine of breastfeeding stories that address the question, what do I really want to say that we're not capturing properly with the other methodology, with the photo voice? I'm just going to show you really quickly. Here's a product, the end product. And I'll see if I can get permission to share this more broadly with the whole audience. But it's 5 community expert stories in their own words, cartooned out, that includes really deep knowledge and wisdom around understanding breastfeeding as sembrando amor, sowing the seeds of love. It includes challenges with historical challenges with African Americans and how they have not breastfed in certain ways due to the legacies of racism and other things. It's just very interesting and fresh. And we were able to get to it because we listened and didn't impose the solution in advance, even though we made some mistakes along the way. We had some huge conflicts to get there as well, but we got to a point of useful community knowledge that was not what anyone planned in advance, and yet we can still show how it connects to health equity outcomes.
Well, I like that example because you're also showing that the research outputs can take a variety of forms. You're in an academic job, you've written books that are published and are read and used as textbooks. So you've got those kinds of outputs that share your work in those kinds of forms. But then you've also got those outputs that tie directly to the audience, the readers, the users, the participants in the community, the people who need to understand the problem, from, in their own terms. So I think that is a really valuable point, hopefully for our attendees here today, to think not only about, you've talked about, kind of identifying your problem, how that can originate from listening and observing, being with the people, but then also thinking about, what I'm hearing is kind of a flexible approach of, you're not throwing out what you know as a scholar about how to do research, but taking that and putting it into a framework that is more engaged and collaborative, that can allow for other directions to come. I think, when in a lot of the discussion that we have on method space, and we're talking about research design and trying to say, well, this is an iterative process. It's not just a matter, I think, as a new researcher, sometimes people think like, okay, I've written it all down, here it all is, I'll do step one, then I'll do step two, and then, here it goes. But to realize that you need to build in some other activities. And I think you've really given some good examples of that, in real life. And, while our attendees, may be in very different cultural settings. I mean, I think for myself, even, where I live in Boulder, Colorado, if I were doing research, I wouldn't need to be going into an indigenous community to find a situation where people have a completely different, understanding than I do, and also don't understand, what research is and why it is important, or why they should even, talk with me. So, I think, this clearly, it's not something that, you can achieve overnight. I think you've made it clear that, there's a lot of time involved. So
Could I add one more thing?
Yes, go ahead.
It's not, and this ties back to relation building. It's not just, I completely agree, it's emergent so that you can respond to what people actually want and need. But it's also relationship building that responds, that acknowledges that you don't know the solution in advance, that
Right.
other people's knowledge can and should inform it. And in some cases, most cases, be more important than your expert knowledge as you come in. It's a shift from expertise to facilitation and role playing, playing a role in a situation, and really saying, we don't know the answers in advance as much as we're pretending we do. And so I want to just highlight that it's the relationship building process is not just so that we can learn through emergent process, which absolutely is fundamental. It's also so that we can create space for other expert knowledges to emerge to inform what we actually end up doing.
I think I just wanted to add to that, Janet, just going back to your question previously about the conflict between expectations of institutions such as universities and funding bodies and what stakeholders and participants want in community. And I think for me that we need to be somewhat empathetic to those differences. And one of the reasons for that is that, often policies and programs and grants are determined in very centralized locations. So I previously mentioned that Warburton is 1,600 kilometers from the closest capital city, where a lot of programs and policies are being established. And often people in those positions have very, very little idea of the social and cultural context of the programs which are going to impact the lives of people on the ground. And it's our responsibility as researchers and practitioners to become, a term that I quite like is a translation agent for helping those people understand what life is really like for people on the ground, and also enabling participants to tell their stories to help people understand. And I just wanted to offer a very quick example, is that the women that I was working with in Warburton, one morning after school breakfast, were sitting around the breakfast table, everything had been cleared up, they were having a cup of tea, and suddenly they were having a conversation in Ngundarra, which I had very limited understanding of at the time. And they turned to me and said, oh, RB, which is what they called me. They said, we need to write a storybook about the breakfast minma. And that is exactly what materialized. They wrote this beautiful pictorial book about their work as breakfast women and about children coming to school and having breakfast. And it had a whole host of flow-on effects for them, which I'll just touch on very briefly. So first of all, there was a real sense of pride in having developed this book, which showed their pride in being workers. And then they talked about themselves as being role models for the young people in the community. The book got published and it got sold on a website here in Australia. But just in terms of what we're talking about informing people in other contexts about life, they took this book to Perth, and it was launched by the Minister for Education, and 10 women were there to be able to stand up and tell their story about what it meant to them to be workers and to work in their context. And there were some very, very influential people in the room. And that was a way of us as participatory action researchers to support people to help tell their stories to a range of different audiences. So there's a two-way learning going on, that the women were starting to learn about policies and programs developed in central areas, and that those people that are developing them were starting to get a bit of a sense of what life was like for those women and the influence of policies and programs on them.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
If I could just make the, if I could just follow on from Rod's, what happens in these types of contexts is that we develop materials which not only the people themselves get pride from, but as they put together these materials, they get to clarify for themselves the nature of the work that they're doing and the impact of the work that they're doing.
Right.
So they understand themselves and their work in a much richer way. But the other aspect of it is that those materials can be taken to the institution. And when we talk about the institution, we're talking about the people in the institution who are responsible for monitoring research and ensuring that it doesn't do any harm. And they've got ethical procedures they guard very carefully. And sometimes those ethical procedures can seem like they're just a barrier. So they are stakeholders in your project, and you need to work with them, develop a relationship with them that enable you to use those materials so that they can better understand the nature of what you're engaged in, and they can help you work your way through the ethical procedures in ways that enable you to maintain the integrity of your program. So think of those people, not the institution, as stakeholders in the research processes. I might say that there was a whole range of materials that Ros developed with those ladies. We were able to take them to academic conferences, and they would give presentations. Lovely to see these desert ladies in an academic context speaking and answering questions from the audience because they knew their stuff so well, because their knowledge had been developed through the development of these materials. Very exciting stuff.
I think we should also note, sorry, Alfredo, that they actually became, these resources, the books that the women developed actually became a set of meaningful literacy resources for the school, which the school largely depended on external resources for helping kids to read. But a set of these ended up in all of the schools across the Nunandarra lands to help enhance meaningful learning and learning to read for the children.
I just want to add two quick things to what they're both of them saying.
Yes.
So, two questions. One, how does knowledge travel, and how can that knowledge be used to influence spaces? I'm not going to go. We've done a recent project focused on that, creating visuals from people's experiences, but I think they just covered that. And then the second question is, do community stories, does community knowledge survive the academic process? So to what extent, when we get to these academic products at the end of a process, has the community knowledge survived, or has it been abstracted away where we can no longer recognize it? And these are examples that they're giving of keeping the community story alive and in a form that allows it to travel and influence people, policy, including themselves, in a way that's tangible and in some ways more powerful than a trickle-down journal article.
And can be incorporated into things like a PhD dissertation,
Right.
I might say.
So one of the questions we have from our audience kind of ties into, you've talked a lot about kind of communication as far as listening and engaging, but on a practical level, how do you deal with language differences? Did you speak the same languages, or were they speaking English, or how did you bridge language differences?
I'll say to myself, generally speaking, the people that we worked with understood fairly fundamental English.
Mhm.
And my task was to, my task personally, when working with these people, was to speak with them in straightforward English that I thought they could understand, and check with them, do you understand what I was saying? And checking that they understood in a variety of different ways, in fact. And then listening to what they were saying and trying to assist them to articulate what they were saying by saying, would you like to discuss that in your own language? In this case, Nanadara. And they would talk in their own language and then come back to me and say, E.T., they'd call me E.T. Extraterrestrial? No. Ernest Thomas Stringer, E.T. They would come back to me and say, no, we're talking about, whatever it was. So there's a range of ways in which you can make sure that you're communicating effectively. If you can't do that, then you do need somebody who speaks the language or speaks both languages working alongside of you as your co-researcher. And there's a whole lot of stuff wrapped up in that we haven't got time to go into, but co-researching, very, very important.
It is very important. Look, I think it's an excellent question. And I just wanted to comment that I think anyone working in these contexts, it's incredibly important to make an effort to learn the language. And whereas for many of us who have come from a primarily English-speaking background may struggle to learn that language, particularly complex languages like Nanandara, I think when you make an effort to learn the language, number one, that is valued and helps you build relationships. But number two, learning the language is an learning the language is an insight into many cultural aspects of life in community. And that was certainly a way that I tried to position myself within the context that I've worked.
And I'll just add one thing. We wrote about this. I can share this thing too. We were working in a process in Peru in Spanish, and we were working with Quechuan speaking people that their first language Quechuan. They learned Spanish. So we also assumed they could, they could defend themselves well enough in Spanish. And we realized at a certain point that some of the rural women we were working with, in Spanish, they wouldn't or they couldn't express some of the deep knowledge they had around violence and treatment of women in rural areas. And when we switched to skits, they came alive as actors in full gear, completely mimicking what's going on, sharing a knowledge in a very different way, and they performed them in Quechua. And so what we realized was epistemic justice. People need to be able to speak in the languages that allow them to express themselves. And yeah, we need to find ways to translate. I love what Ernie's example of saying, hey, do you need to just talk about that for a while? And us let go of control. We don't need to hear everything. We don't need to record everything. The purpose is to get to somewhere meaningful. And that sometimes means finding ways to allow people to work in their own languages, and for us to find ways to then translate pieces of that to be able to say what we learned and how we can use it to support for future change process.
Yeah, I might also just note that although this first book wasn't translated into Nanandara, the subsequent books that were written by the women and other community members were all translated, and we acknowledge that was a very important part of the process and important given that it became a resource for community and learning.
So I'd like to make an important point here. We've been talking about working with diverse cultural people. A central part of that process is that we are learning from them all the time. And my learning of how to do research in Aboriginal communities translated into the US, working in places like New Mexico, Texas, Upper New York State, Illinois, and doing projects in mainstream contexts, US contexts. I was able to articulate what I'd learned about what we used to call Aboriginal community-based research into action research that obviously has relevance to a whole range of contexts. And in fact, it led to the
Yes.
writing the first edition of Action Research that clearly resonates with many, many people in mainstream contexts, and is now in its 27 years later in its 5th edition. We three are planning the 6th edition because people enjoy and are informed by what we learned in other contexts. So we are the beneficiaries as much as the beneficiaries who
Right.
we work with.
Well, you know, we certainly hope as researchers that we choose this line of work because we want to learn and we want to discover. And I really want to, you know, highlight one of the points that you've made about not going into the research thinking that you already have the answer. If you already have the answer, then why even bother? You're done. So, but having an open mind. I know when I was working with doctoral students, I would say, if you think you know the answer to this and you are passionate about that, you need to pick something else to study, because that's not what research is. It's not about confirming what you already know. It's about discovering something new. So I think you've been really powerful in your explanations of that. I think we are just about at our time. We don't have any further questions from our
Actually,
audience.
Janet, people would like to
Yes.
know where they can get Roz's book. Or not
Yeah,
Roz's
I'll be
book, I'm sorry, but the books that Roz was
Yeah.
affiliated with. And I did put the link in for the action research book from Ernie.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's on the SNAIC website, which is snaicc.org, and you'll be able to find a link to the book through their resources or through their bookshop.
Well, thank you very much all today to Roz, to Ernie, to Alfredo, and of course to our genial methods guru, Janet. So thank you very much. This will appear on the MethodSpace website, and you will also get a link to the recording in the next couple of days. It's the weekend coming up, so probably a little bit longer than usual, but we will be sending that out. And pay attention to the fine work that our guests have done, and pay attention to what's going on in MethodSpace. Sign up for that Methods Minute newsletter, and we will see you all at the next one. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.